Your brain will replay the same 3 sentences of a conversation 40 times before you fall asleep tonight, and it genuinely thinks it's helping you. That's the part nobody tells you. The overthinking is not a flaw in your character. It is your brain doing exactly what it was designed to do in exactly the wrong situation. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why that happens, where it comes from, and this is the part I really want you to stay for, what 3 of the oldest wisdom traditions on earth figured out about how to stop it. Because they all landed on the same answer, independently and thousands of years apart. That convergence is the thing almost nobody talks about, but we are going to. First, let's make sure we are on the same page about what we're actually dealing with. Most people who struggle with overthinking think that the problem is that they might be too smart, too sensitive, or maybe too anxious. They try to think their way out of it. They make lists, they analyze the situation from every angle, they have that imaginary argument in the shower where they finally say the perfect thing, and it doesn't work. Because the problem is not a lack of thinking, the problem is actually quite the opposite. So let me show you where this actually starts. And I want to start with a man who figured this out before we had brain scans, before we had psychology textbooks, and even before we had a word for it. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, and here is the thing about Siddhartha that most people skip over. He was not a monk who grew up poor and detached from the world. He grew up in a palace. He had wealth, comfort, and every distraction available to him. And at some point in his 30s, he walked away from all of it. He sat under a tree and he spent years doing one thing, watching his own mind. Not other people's minds, his own. He was not theorizing, he was simply observing. And what he noticed became one of the most precise descriptions of human suffering ever recorded. He taught it through a simple story. Imagine that you're walking through a forest and an arrow strikes you in the arm. It is painful, it's real, immediate, and it causes physical pain. That is the first arrow. Life fired it. You did not ask for it, and you can't take it back. But then almost instantly, your mind fires a second arrow. What's going to happen? What if I bleed to death? What if this gets infected and I can't walk back? What if I lose energy and can't get back to my family? The second arrow, all the catastrophizing, the replaying, the imagined futures, that one you fired yourself. Now, sit with that for a second because it is actually more radical than it sounds. The Buddha was not saying that pain is not real or telling you to pretend that everything is fine. He was saying something much simpler and more useful. You don't get a choice about the first arrow, but the second one, the shame spiral, the replay loop, the 2 a.m. reconstruction of a conversation that happened 3 weeks ago, that one has a different origin, and it's optional in a way that the first one never was. Here's where it gets really interesting because this is not just an ancient philosophy. This is your brain right now doing something very specific. Psychologists call it rumination. And here's the key thing to understand about it. The mind replaced the same meeting, the same argument, and the same fear as if grinding on it harder will finally change the outcome. Researchers who study rumination describe it as a kind of neural loop where the brain keeps circling unresolved emotional content without ever actually generating a solution. Listen to that again, without generating a solution. So your brain is running this loop not because it's trying to resolve the problem, but because it's flagged the situation as unresolved and it can't stop trying. One explanation researchers point to is that your brain's threat system seems to treat an unresolved emotional problem the same way that it treats an open physical threat, something to keep scanning, to keep processing, and to keep the alarm on for. And here is the cruel irony about that. The harder you try to think your way through an emotional problem, the more your brain treats the thinking itself as evidence that the threat is still active. So that loop tightens and the replays get more vivid, the imagined conversations get more elaborate. You're really not solving the problem, you're actually feeding it. I watched this exact pattern for over 30 years in the corporate environments I worked in, and it never once had anything to do with how smart or capable the person was. For example, someone says something in a meeting, or they send an email that they second guess the moment it's out. The meeting ends and the email is gone. The outcome is already in motion, but their brain will spend the next 3 days reconstructing every word, every facial expression, every possible interpretation of what their manager may have thought afterwards. The situation is over, but the brain did not get the memo. That is the second arrow playing out in a conference room instead of a forest. And I watched some of the sharpest people I ever worked with carry dozens of them at once, including myself. Now, here is what I really want you to understand. And this is the part where the story gets bigger. What the Buddha was describing 2,500 years ago has a name in your brain right now. At its core, the process engages what neuroscientists call the default mode network. This is a constellation of interconnected brain regions that activate when the mind is not focused on external tasks. When you are not actively doing something, this network switches on. And for a lot of people, when it switches on, it doesn't rest. It ruminates. It goes back to the unresolved stuff. Overthinking is the everyday word for what psychologists call rumination. And it appears to have real neurological underpinnings, which helps explain why it feels so hard to just decide to stop. And the really striking part is that a tired, overloaded brain has less capacity to regulate itself. When you finally stop working and lie there in the dark, your default mode network gets the opening it's been waiting for, and it drags you back into old stories. That is why it always hits hardest at night. And that is why the thoughts that feel manageable at noon feel catastrophic at 11 p.m. Your brain's ability to interrupt the loop is weakest exactly when the loop is loudest. So we have the Buddhist diagnosis, the second arrow. We have the neuroscience pointing at why it's so hard to shut off a threat detection loop with nowhere to go. And now I want to bring in a second tradition, because this is where it gets really powerful. Around the same era, a completely different culture on the other side of the world was working on the exact same problem, Taoism, and specifically the concept of Wu Wei. Wu Wei is often translated as non-doing or effortless action, but the translation misses the real point. It is not about doing nothing, it is about stopping the compulsive grip. The Taoist teachers noticed the same thing that Buddha noticed, that the human mind has a tendency to force, to clench, and to chase every thought and demand a resolution. And they said, the river does not force its way around the rock, it flows. The thought comes, you don't have to chase it and you don't have to fight it, you just let it pass through. That is a completely different instruction than stop thinking. Stopping thinking is impossible, and everyone who has ever tried to meditate for 5 minutes knows this. Wu Wei is not about stopping, it is about not gripping. When the thought arrives, you notice it, but do not follow it. You let it move through the way a cloud moves through the sky. It was there, and now it's not. And you did not have to do anything to make that happen. The Taoists and the Buddhists from entirely different cultures with different frameworks arrived at the same core practice. Observe the thought without becoming the thought. Do not shoot the second arrow. And then there is a third voice, and I want you to hear this because this is the moment in the video where I think something could click for most people. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6. Jesus is speaking in the Sermon on the Mount, and he says something most people have heard but maybe never really absorbed. The old King James phrasing puts it the sharpest. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof, which simply means today already has enough in it. Don't go borrowing tomorrow's. 3 traditions, different centuries, different continents, different frameworks, and they all arrived at the same instruction. Stop borrowing pain from a future that hasn't happened yet. Stay here. This moment is enough. The imagined suffering you're adding on top of the real situation, that part is optional. That convergence is not a coincidence. When Buddhism, Taoism, and Christianity all independently land on the same insight about the human mind, that is not philosophy repeating itself. That is 3 different groups of people watching human beings suffer, noticing the same pattern, and pointing at the same exit. And here's what I want you to take from this, because I don't want this to stay abstract. I want you to have something real that you can use next time it is 11 p.m. and your brain won't stop. The first practice comes straight from the Buddhist tradition, and it is almost embarrassingly simple. When you catch yourself in the loop, replaying the conversation, rebuilding the scenario, or catastrophizing the outcome, just ask yourself one question. Is this the second arrow? That's it. Sometimes quietly saying, "I see you, second arrow," takes away so much of the power. You're not trying to stop the thought, you're just naming what is happening. And naming it creates a gap. In that gap, you have a choice. The second practice is the Taoist one, and it is about what you do with the thought once you have named it. The instruction is not to fight it. The instruction is to let it pass through without following it. When the thought comes, what if they think I'm incompetent? Or what if the conversation ruined everything? You do not argue with it, don't try to solve it, and you don't try to suppress it. You just watch it arrive, breathe, and let it move. Fighting reality only increases the suffering. Accepting what is without judgment is what lets you meet it with more calm than you thought you had. The thought is not a command, it's just noise. And the third practice is the simplest. It comes from that line in Matthew. Today has enough trouble of its own. When the spiral starts pulling you into tomorrow, into the imagined disasters, the future embarrassments, or the worst case scenarios that haven't happened and probably will never happen, bring yourself back to what is actually in front of you right now. Not tomorrow's meeting, not next week's conversation, but right now, this moment. What is real right now? That grounding question is a circuit breaker. It pulls you from the imagined threat back into the present, where the threat is usually much smaller than your story your brain built around it. Here's what I want you to walk away with. You are not broken because you overthink. Your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. Scanning for threats, trying to resolve open loops. It's trying to protect you. The problem is that it cannot tell the difference between a real threat that needs solving and an emotional wound that simply needs time. It fires that second arrow because it thinks it's helping. It's not. And now you know that. And knowing it changes the way you relate to the loop. The Buddha watched his own mind under a tree and saw the second arrow. The Taoists watched the river and understood that you stop gripping. And Jesus stood on a mountain and told a crowd of people that today is enough. The moment where a human being realizes that most of their suffering is not the original pain, it is the story they built around it. You started this video thinking about overthinking as a problem you have. I want you to leave understanding it as a pattern your brain runs. One you can now recognize, name, and interrupt. That is not a small thing. That is the beginning of a completely different relationship with your own mind. If this landed with you, drop a comment below. Tell me which of the three traditions resonated with you the most. The Buddhist second arrow, the Taoist letting go, or that line from Matthew. And if you know someone who lies awake at night replaying conversations, share this with them. There's a video right here where that same default mode network shows up again, but this time it leads somewhere completely different. It's the one I'd watch next. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.